Hello, class. Welcome to your course on spirit and nature. As you can see, your instructor is a potato, and he lives in the soil, that is nature. And when it comes time to grow, he sprouts up into the upper world, and that's the spirit. Although being a potato, I'm mostly earthy and naturey. In all seriousness, I wish I could teach this whole class as a potato. But alas, my powerful editing software Camtasia and Snap Camera don't get along. Whenever you get bored with the little talking head bubble of your actual professor, just think back to the potato. He's there with you, helping you learn. The potato had a crown, which I guess represented his spiritual aspects. This is another cool Snap Camera filter, the mystic veil. Another good metaphor for the relation of spirit to nature. Hopefully Snap Camera and Camtasia can figure out their differences. Otherwise, I might end up looking more like this throughout the semester.
Will you fly like a teacher in the sky?
Take it again.
So I think our canvas and all the other aspects of the course are fairly clearly laid out on the page. You can read the syllabus, of course, this week, and also study the homepage. Don't worry about the enormous number of readings because they're just there to have options, so there'll be different pathways through the class. You'll only be responsible for reading the material that you do your assignments on. I hope at the very least that everybody will listen to the professor's lecture every week, because that will be geared towards providing a more comprehensive overview of all the readings in a given week, so that you can then choose which ones to focus on based on your interest. And then there are the also pretty comprehensive lecture slides. Although this is a fully asynchronous class, I noticed that classes which had some synchronous Zoom discussions last semester invariably went much better than ones that didn't. So I'll be offering optional extra credit Zoom discussions, and you can read more about those in Canvas. They'll be starting in week 3. And there are also opportunities to field practical questions. And you're welcome to send me an email between now and then as well. You can see that the catalog description for the course here mentions that we will cover the critical connection between religion and nature, and then various specific issues and representative sources in world religions. The approach is rooted in the field of religion and ecology, which got going in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Study of spiritual aspects of ecological thought, however, extends far beyond the discipline of religious studies, and this catalog description doesn't seem to have been updated in a long time. Accordingly, we'll be doing the religious studies, or the religions and ecology stuff, mostly in the first half of the course, as explained in the section description, before going on to a number of other issues in contemporary literature having to do with philosophy, humanities, religious studies, and nature. This is the first time I'm teaching this specific course, and I'm really excited about the curriculum I've put together for you guys. You'll notice here under required text, the vast majority of text you need are in the course pack. You can download the whole thing on my website, that's matthiaswarnes.com, or you can just download the readings individually, as they're going to be in each week's modules. The other 2 books that are assigned are Daniel Pinchbeck's How Soon Is Now and Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. These will be covered in the course, mostly only in student presentations, so you can safely get one of these 2 books. And if you don't do your presentation on either of these 2 authors, there will be other options. However, I strongly recommend that everybody at least listens to the excellent audible.com version of Daniel Pinchbeck's recent book, How Soon Is Now? A Handbook for Global Change. It's probably the most up-to-date and relevant reading across the course on the connection between spirituality and contemporary world ecological issues. So without further ado, let's talk about religion. Whether you participate in a religion or have a specific religious worldview, whether you might understand yourself as spiritual but not religious, whether you identify yourself as neither spiritual nor religious, and are simply interested in taking this course and learning more about the religions and spiritualities of the world, ancient and contemporary, there will be a little something for people of every persuasion in this course. It's customary in teaching any course with a religious studies aspect to begin with some basic discussion about the definition of and nature of religion. The influential theories have been proposed since the 19th and 20th centuries especially. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim's definition: religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices in relation to sacred things. Purpose is to unite human beings in a community, or in the broadest sense, a church. Seeming to be almost the opposite of this, William James, the American pragmatist, defines religion in terms of private feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, in their relation to the divine. Paul Tillich defines religion most broadly as what is of ultimate concern. All three definitions, despite their significant differences, seem to be sympathetic to religion, to the value of studying it. Max Muller, often thought to be the father of comparative religion, sometimes alongside Mircea Eliade, writes, "A person who knows only one religion understands none." Some theories of religion are more reductive and dismissive, such as Sigmund Freud's. He understands religion as a projection of childhood experience and as a universal obsessional neurosis. Marx is famous for having said that religion is the opium of the people. That is, a consolation prize which distracts and consoles us, distracts us from the imminent task of reshaping history-making forces and modes of production. James Fraser wrote The Golden Bough and understands religion in its most primitive form, quote-unquote, as a belief in spirits within nature, animism, and later developing into monotheisms. The pragmatist view values religion because religions produce meaning and vitality in human life. Carl Jung understands religious and spiritual experiences in terms of the psychological process of individuation, personal development, and refers religious phenomena back to manifestations through the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Rudolf Otto wrote a wonderful book on the nature of religion in which he grounded it in the experience and the concept of the holy, or sacred, which he called the numinous, or of mystery, tremendous, or causing trembling and fascinating, sometimes inducing fear or other awe-inspiring experiences. And the list goes on and on. Whenever we study a specific religion, we always can study it from different lenses and viewpoints. And these are the key features of different religions. Religions generally involve a belief system, a community, central myths, prescribed rituals, a certain ethical code or ethical norms or laws, various emotional and numinous experiences, material expressions of those religions, such as temple or other key artifacts to be used in a religious context, and of course, a defining sense of sacredness for that religion. I would say that all religions attempt to answer questions such as what is ultimate reality, how should we live in this world, and what is our ultimate purpose. I tend to think of the term and phenomena religion as something universal and going back a very long way, maybe to the origin of the human species. Sometimes primatologists study the behavior of animals, such as monkeys, in relation to certain places in which they seem to behave differently. It's been suggested that some groups of monkeys have a relationship to the dead and their ancestors. And the phenomena of human religion is traced by archaeologists and paleontologists, phenomena of death and the burial of the dead. There is much discussion in various anthropological and humanistic literatures about the religions of Paleolithic and Neolithic peoples. Our earliest ancestors out of Africa, of the first major world civilizations which ensued, such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, all of which were animated by complex religious ideologies and practices. And of course, in the Western context, we look at ancient Greek mythology and recognize immediately that it is a very complicated religion. The word religion itself, to describe such a vast arena of human experience, culture, history, and behavior, had to be invented, and it was invented in the Roman world. The word religion is a Latin word. Re in religion means again, as in repetition, and the lig in religio or religere means to join or to connect, to bind. The Roman orator and philosopher Cicero provides two etymologies which came to be understood as a little conflicting in the history of religious studies. One is religare, from lig, which is a binding of the human and the divine, and the other is religere, from legere, which is gathering of the human and the divine, or careful respect. Notice how even in the two competing etymologies of the term religion, There is significant divergence in our understanding of what a religion is, how it functions, and what it does. Focusing on the binding, we might be led to understand religions as obligatory affairs having to do with duty, and limiting the freedom of human beings to just do, believe, or worship in whichever way seems fit to them. Focusing on the second etymology, phenomena of religion seems more open-ended, having to do with ritual and cultural actions on the part of human beings that bring them into a relationship to the divine without constraining them. This is far from being just an obscure etymological point. Take a survey of the contemporary global population and say, religion, go, religion, what does it mean to you? And some people who either love or hate, quote-unquote, religion, will give reasons for their beliefs, explaining why, tend to understand the term in terms of either one or the other of these two etymological roots. Love for the fundamentalism of strict religious observance, or rejection of the idea that religion is something which obligates us, both falling in the first etymology, and a more tolerant or cosmopolitan understanding of religion as anything that relates and gathers human being in view of the sacred or divine, whether you think such a thing exists or not, would veer more towards the second etymology. Of course, a very important question for our course, how does religion relate to spirituality or to spirit? For now, I would just ask that everybody taking this course suspends completely whatever they take the phenomena religion and the term religion to be at the outset, and the same goes for the term spirituality. Both these terms are extremely nebulous and extremely precise depending on who you're talking to and where you're looking, and also various different conceptions of the two and their relationship makes any naive oppositions of one to the other suspect at the beginning of a course like this. Conceptions of the sacred or the holy also vary greatly across the various religions and spiritualities of the world, both historical and contemporary. The sacred or the holy could be understood as Brahman, the Tao, the Great Mother, the Great Spirit, the ground of being, the mystery, the ultimate, the absolute, the divine, and the holy. Again, etymology is particularly important here. Despite one odd Rate My Professor review which dinged me for teaching the root meanings of Latin words such as I guess that student didn't care too much for learning where her language comes from and how it informs her usage in the meaning of words. In fact, the sacred and the holy are two different words with different etymologies. The Latin word sacre means that which is charged with divine presence but forbidden to touch, except perhaps on certain ritual occasions or for certain priests. So although the sacred has a positive feature, charged with divine presence, its meaning is predominantly negative. Don't mess with that, it's sacred. This is very different from the historical etymology of the term holy, which derives not from Latin, but from Gothic and older Indo-European heil, which has a more purely positive presence as that which is blessed and greeted or suffused with divine presence in the context of religious observances, just singing hymns to the sun and greeting it. For centuries, however, the Oxford English Dictionary has tended to use the terms sacred and holy interchangeably, and our own usage tends to reflect the oblivion of these important etymological differences. And now the many theisms. Living in a Christian and post-Christian culture, we're most familiar with monotheism, the belief in one God. Although polytheism was the norm for global humanity, from the dawn of history through to the 6th century BC, the Axial Age revolution, and it was only phased out after the emergence of Judeo-Christianity in the 5th century AD. Pantheism is a view we'll study extensively, the belief that all is God and thus that God is nature in some sense and nature is God. Henotheism tends to be an earlier form of monotheism which recognizes the existence of many gods but argues that they are all ultimately aspects or manifestations of one singular deity, from the Greek term hen or one. We moderns tend to think of atheism as a disbelief in the gods or as a secular scientific attitude. Ancient atheism, in the sources we have from Greek religion, because atheism is of course a Greek word, are very different. The atheist may not necessarily disbelieve in the existence of God or the gods, but rather God or the gods have abandoned and accursed the atheist, the atheos, the one who lives without the presence of the divine. Next, not all religions are theistic. The earliest forms of Buddhism are often said to be non-theistic. This doesn't mean it denied the existence of gods or the god, but it doesn't put any particular emphasis on them in the quest for human salvation or enlightenment. A transtheistic religion is similar to a non-theistic one, but often allows for the presence and the importance of gods while transcending them, again placing its emphasis on other concerns as being the core of the religion. Monism might be understood as both a philosophical or a religious doctrine, teaching that all reality, whatever reality is one. An agnostic is one who suspends judgment regarding the existence or non-existence or importance of the gods or any other religious question, and so is to be distinguished from an atheist in the modern sense, whose mind is more made up. In religions with a transcendent flair, the sacred, the holy, or God tends to be beyond this world, and human beings may have the feature as well of transcendence in their immortal souls, our true being residing not here on earth, but in a transcendental sphere. Or religions might have more of an emphasis on the immanent, the sacred or the holy or the gods or gods being within and of the world, if not the same as the world. Historian of religion Mircea Eliade used the term hierophany to explain how the sacred or holy manifests itself in particular places. Hieros being the Greek word for the holy, which is etymologically linked to hyle, as we discussed earlier, having to do with manifestation, presencing, and greeting. Eliade defines hierophany as acts of manifestation of the sacred, that is, events where anything that is transcendent or of transcendence within the religion manifests itself immanently through immanence. Events of hierophany tend to be foundational for the various religions, such as the pilgrimage to the Kaaba in Mecca, Muslims undertake known as the Hajj, and during which Allah's presence is manifest to a superlative degree as it was to Muhammad when he purified the original Kaaba of its polytheistic worship. So all religions have distinctive cosmogonies and anthropogonies as well, that is, explanations of the origin of the world as a whole, as well as explanations of the origins of human beings. Well, I shouldn't say all religions have cosmogonies. It may be that a few very ancient forms of human religion, such as Aboriginal Australian myth and religion, explain the world as having no origin and having always existed. Particularly relevant for this course, religions vary greatly in their attitudes to nature. For some, nature is the Great Mother herself. For others, nature is a fallen and contaminated realm. And for many others, there's a middle ground here. Religions also vary in their understanding of time. For some, time is ephemeral and lesser than eternity, just a fleeting moment. For others, time is the holy itself, and we ourselves are time. In the Abrahamic faiths, which includes Christianity, time tends to be understood in a linear way, having a beginning, a middle, events of hierophany in between, and an endpoint, such that everything that happens only once in a divine narrative or God's plan. Many indigenous and historical religions tend to conceive time instead as cyclical, undergoing great patterned cycles that repeat themselves over and over in various dimensions. And religions also vary greatly in their explanation, not just of the origin, but of the purpose or function of human beings in the cosmos. Why are we here? What purpose, functions do we serve in the cosmic and divine order of things? What is the meaning of human life? Where do we fit in? Lastly, religions vary greatly in their understanding of the importance and sacrality of the word, language, or logos, and the difference between everyday speech and extraordinary or sacred speech, such as in the liturgy. Some religions privilege the word as the medium of religious revelation. Others point rather to symbols and sacred practices of music, dance, and ritual. Is true reality the divine or the holy, transcendent or immanent? Is the universe created or eternal? Is nature perfect or imperfect? Is time cyclical or linear? Are human beings a central part or a peripheral part of nature? Are words and scriptures all important for our access to the holy, or are they inadequate, supplemental, and provisional? Should a religion be an exclusive society or an inclusive one? And should they be one or the other? These questions are easy to pose but difficult to answer, and each religion, as we'll see, is going to have a different mode of approach. Another useful tool used by students of comparative religion in looking at religious phenomena in the human sphere is to notice that all religions tend to have three different types of religious practice or experience: the sacramental, the prophetic, and the mystical. A sacramental approach to religion emphasizes ritual, usually prescribed ritual performed in the correct way according to tradition, though there are various radical sacramentalisms out there which still emphasize the sacramental function of religion while eschewing certain aspects of the tradition. The Catholic Eucharist or Tibetan sand painting and mandalas would both be examples of the sacramental function in religion. The prophetic dimension of religion tends to emphasize belief, morality, and a future time. Think of the ancient Hebrew prophets, who rail against the iniquities of their contemporaries as a way of explaining God's abandonment and looking forward to a future age in which true faith and true morality will again reign. Lastly, all the world's religions end up developing a mystical branch, which emphasizes a sense of oneness with God or the universe. What is more, this oneness is accessible to internal or personal religious experiences. For the mystical parts of a religion, tradition is not so fixed as it may seem according to the orthodox position. Mystics very often flirt with various forms of heresy, but always within their pursuit of a more radical and lived experience of the sacred or the holy. The Judaic, Islamic, and Christian worlds all developed rich mystical traditions, but usually only after their canonical texts and authorized interpretations were well established. The mystical parts of a religion thus reinforce and at the same time problematize various aspects of orthodoxy. Walk into any major world library and you'll find that religion and the study of religion, religious studies, is never just in one section. Yes, there is the history of religions or religious studies section in the Dewey Decimal System, but all the diverse disciplinary branches of human knowledge develop extensive studies of religious phenomena. So within psychology, you'll find a section, the psychology of religion. Within mythology, you'll find a section, mythology and religion. Within philosophy, you'll find a section, philosophy of religion. Theology, you'll find a section, theology and the global religions, and so on. Whenever we study a course with a religious studies emphasis, we're always utilizing the diverse findings of various disciplines which study religious phenomena in many ways. In approaching religions academically, we seek four key virtues. One is balance between an insider and an outsider approach. Too far outside and we miss the phenomena that is being studied from the point of view of lived experience. Too far inside and we can't see the forest for the trees. Empathy is also an important virtue, putting ourselves in the minds of the person who has religious beliefs or having religious experiences. Being comparative is another important virtue, as is being multidisciplinary when we begin to study religions and religious studies. The comparative study of religion allies itself to no particular religion and tends to be deeply suspicious of claims to absolute truth on the part of various religions. The discipline as a whole is neither pro-religious or anti-religious, though many scholars within it would categorize themselves as one or the other. It's also a fairly exciting, eccentric, and radical discipline and field of study we'll be engaging with here because scholars of and students of religion are often playing with some pretty powerful fire, and they sometimes get a little bit burnt. The comparative study of religion is comprehensively interdisciplinary, and yet it's still its own thing. And studying religions comparatively, like we'll be doing, probably will change you and your worldview, so be warned. An important notion, subtending and moving across many units in our course, is that of a major shift or turning point in the history of religions. Very often religions develop on their own, in their own historical life worlds, but pretty fascinatingly, religions all over the world, at least the major ones we've still inherited today, seem to have undergone dramatic shifts in similar directions at around the same period in history, the so-called Axial Age, from around the 9th to the 2nd century BCE. This notion of an axial age transformation of global consciousness, and accordingly a transformation of the nature of religion, and religious traditions was first originated by German philosopher and psychologist Karl Jaspers. In religious studies, the scholar Karen Armstrong has written a book on it more recently, and in a nutshell, she writes, from about 900 to 200 BCE, in 4 distinct regions, the great world traditions that have continued to nourish humanity came into being: Confucianism and Taoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. This was the period of the Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, the mystics of the Upanishads, Mencius, and Euripides. During this period of intense creativity, spiritual and philosophical geniuses pioneered an entirely new kind of human experience. Another major transformation in the nature of religious worship is the decline of anthropomorphism, which also occurred during the axial period. This is controversial because sometimes it's posited that anthropomorphism had a genesis somewhere during the Bronze Age, and that previous religious consciousness was less anthropomorphic and more in touch with forms and forces in nature. In any case, the decline of anthropomorphism was short-lived insofar as in the 3 monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, anthropomorphism in their conception of the divine made a stunning comeback that has endured to this day. Nowadays, you're more likely to find scholars speaking of the overcoming of anthropocentrism. Maybe understanding the divine and nature on the model of the human body, the axis mundi or great man, isn't so bad, but certainly understanding the purpose of all creation in terms of serving the will or being under the dominion of human beings or being centered around human existence in some way is part of what has led us into some dangerous territory when it comes to our relationship to nature, the planet, and the survival of everything. It's interesting that nowadays we talk about theories of religion. In the ancient Greek context, the word theory, or theoria, or the theoros, the theorist, is less somebody who's creating an abstract speculation about something and trying to explain it, and more somebody who's actually undergoing a religious experience. Theoria originally meant a spectacle or cosmic vision or divine contemplation. Totally different than our modern quip, hey, that's just a theory. It referred to the practice of pilgrimage whereby an emissary or seer, a theoros, would travel from one city to another in order to witness extraordinary events like festivals and rituals. It always involved leaving home, witnessing divine things on a journey abroad, and returning to one's home city in order to report on what one witnessed. Thomas Tweed quips, "Theory is travel." We've already mentioned the axial age and its global transformation of religions. We'll explore that more in depth as the course proceeds, but a basic chronological map of transformations of religious consciousness across the existence of the human species as we know it might go a little bit like this. Prior to 8000 BCE, we're a bit in the dark as to the types of religious practices of Paleolithic peoples. They were obviously hunter-gatherers. They had some complex form of shamanism and spirituality. They seem to have worshipped a sky god and humans in animal forms, as well as having a sympathetic, perhaps magical relationship to animals, as we read in the Paleolithic cave paintings, and also to have worshipped a goddess mother of some kind, as we learn from the figurines. The picture gets a lot clearer when it comes to the dawn of agriculture and the Neolithic period, and this is followed by a transformation of religious consciousness in terms of the dawn of civilization and empire and the consolidation of the forces of production, distribution, and securitization of power. And of course, after the rise of the great ancient civilizations such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, we then enter into the period of axial age transformation, or an emerging global politics. And that is the era we've been in pretty much since the emergence of modernity in the Renaissance around the 1500s. Modernization is in this sense closely tied to colonialism and to various technological revolutions. The story starts to change pretty rapidly here, and we could have fruitful discussions about religion and spirituality in particular regions or all over the world in each century between the 1500s and today. And yet once again, after the first and the second industrial revolution, it seems that our relationship to religion changed again quite dramatically in the period known as modernism. and once again in what is generally understood as the postmodern period, that is sits roughly the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Worry about fleshing out this really broad map in more detail as we proceed through the course. Colonialism and globalization since the Renaissance has resulted in two overall trends. One is fundamentalism, let's get back to tradition, and the other one is modernism, let's accommodate religions or the lack of religions to progress. And the so-called postmodernists critique progress, at least progress on the model of Enlightenment rationalism, and embrace pluralism as a positive value. I prefer to think of postmodernity as an era rather than a doctrine or an ideology. In terms of the study of religion and our understanding of it, there's no doubt that so-called postmodern philosophers have had an enormous impact on the field of religious studies. We define postmodernism with Lyotard as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. I think there are some problems with this definition, but let's just take it for what it is for now. Then we might be able to locate in postmodernism a sort of heretical imperative when it comes to religions. If we are suspicious or incredulous towards traditional inherited meta-narratives of various kinds, such as God's plan for creation, then we are likely to approach postmodern religious pluralism, a sort of choose-your-own heretical adventure. My view of the era of postmodernists, reading them carefully, involves a far less radical critique of tradition than is generally supposed in contemporary social media these days. Let's talk about the field of religion and ecology, or religious studies and environmentalism. This is a field that really only emerged in the last few decades through growing connections between religion and ecology in writings in various disciplines and fields. Theologians from every religious tradition, along with dozens of non-denominational spiritual writers, have confronted religious attitudes towards nature and religion's deeply complicitous involvement in various environmental crises. This confrontation has given rise to vital new theologies based in the recovery of marginalized elements of tradition, profound criticisms of the past, new visions of God, the sacred earth, and human beings. Religious morality has expanded to include our relation to other species and ecosystems, and religious practice has come to include rituals to help us express our grief and remorse over what is lost and to celebrate what is left. Studying the history, major players, and various approaches to this field will take up roughly a third of our course, I think, when all is said and done. Another wiki that might be helpful to read at the outset of the course is the wiki on spiritual ecology, which is defined here as an emerging field in religion, conservation, and academia, recognizing that there is a spiritual facet to all issues related to conservation, environmentalism, and earth stewardship. The current Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, or Jorge Bergoglio, hailing from Argentina, is sometimes referred to as the Green Pope, and has written a pretty interesting book actually on ecological crises and the Christian religion, Laudato Si, or On Care for Our Common Home. We'll be studying this later in the course. This week we have a variety of introductory readings to choose from. First, for everybody, Roger Gottlieb's Religion in the Age of Environmental Crisis and No Place to Hide, Spirituality, Avoidance, and Denial, both from his anthology, which sort of founded the field of religion and ecology in undergraduate study, This Sacred Earth. After that, you'll have two choices. One is you can read about the medieval Christian mystic Hildegarda van Bingen and her notice of viriditas, or greening power, and as well as Wendell Berry, who's a contemporary environmentalist, farmer, and poet laureate. Or if you're not quite ready for the academic swing of things, I would recommend for the spirit pathway this week that you rewatch Avatar, or watch it if you haven't watched it yet, James Cameron's amazing 2009 film. You can find it on Disney Plus, so if you have a subscription, great. If you don't, you can get a week free and watch it on Disney Plus. It's a really wonderful film. It's Braun Taylor's introductory article about the religion and politics of Avatar from his book Avatar and Nature Spirituality. To keep this video short, I won't lecture on all these readings, but you can find, and generally will be able to find week to week, a summary of each of the assigned readings in the lecture notes. Hildegarda van Bingen is being introduced at this point because she has a very interesting notion of viriditas, or God's greening power. She understands natural creativity and lushness, luxuriance, greenness, vitality of nature as closely connected. And this is what philosophy has tended to call natura naturans, that is, nature's naturing, as opposed to nature as an object or the nature that is produced, which is natura naturata. It's interesting that we moderns and postmoderns tend to forget about nature as a verb. For Hildegarda, it is Christ who brings lush greenness to shriveled and wilted people and institutions. She re-understands the elements of the Trinity and Christian theology in terms of nature's greening power, such as the Word or Logos, which is all verdant greening, all creativity. God is the purest spring or source. The Holy Spirit is greening power in motion, and Christ is greenness incarnate. Hildegarda, a Christian ecological prophetess and the leading herbalist of her time, as well as a polymath in many areas, including music. You can listen to some of Hildegarda's beautiful music online, writes extremely poetically, and is an excellent representative of a form of Benedictine monasticism that is very close to nature. According to her, God himself dictated a greening poem that goes a little bit like this. I am the breeze that nurtures all things green. I encourage blossoms to flourish with ripening fruits. I am the rain coming from the dew that causes the grasses to laugh with the joy of life. The whole cosmos laughs, for it is wet, not dry. Whether and to what extent human spirituality and the fertility of the soul can be considered as benefiting from a wet or a dry place, from a lush meadow or a desert, is going to be another interesting theme in our course. For Jean Evans, viriditas is fecundity. It is fruitfulness, greening power, and is the opposite of ariditas, dryness or absencing. Current state of the earth is a good example of aridification. And what we should be focusing on is a way to make earth and ourselves more lush and green. Along similar lines, contemporary poet laureate and farmer theorist Wendell Berry begins his short piece in the book called Spiritual Ecology by pointing us to the notion of divine love, incarnate and indwelling in the world, and summoning the world always towards its wholeness. He worries even about the term environment, thinking it problematic. This is our home and the home of all living things. For Berry's plain words, mortal life is really very simple. But the machine economy has set fire to the household of the human soul, and all the creatures are burning with it. The root cause of all our ecological woes, for Berry, is the notion of intellectual property, the deed by which the mind is bought and sold, and the world enslaved. Our spiritual life worlds become ghost towns, and human genius barely keeps them alive. Meanwhile, we are losing the colors of extinct birds, like the songs of dead languages. Animals are the real geniuses in Berry's tale because they know how to live in the places where they live. And this is what we should expect of ourselves, a kind of renaturalization. Braun Taylor's introductory piece is at the beginning of a long edited volume on Avatar and nature spirituality. If anybody wants to pick it up, it's another one of those options that you could possibly do for your presentation. Check out the table of contents online and see if you're really into Avatar, then you could potentially find that book. For those who are unfamiliar with the film, Avatar is set on a distant planet, Pandora, a stunningly beautiful, often bioluminescent and lushly vegetated moon circling a gaseous planet in the Alpha Centauri star system. It's mainly about how the colonizers have pursued the land and resources of colonized peoples, but it's also about eco-spirituality and living intelligent systems. That is Gaian intelligence, or Gaian spirituality, which we'll encounter later in the course. The film is really quite deep. The Na'vi, or indigenous peoples of Pandora, were in part modeled on real indigenous peoples, and their spirituality at times resembles Peruvian shamanism and other earth-based indigenous traditions. Yeah, you should really watch it. It's actually a pretty cool film. Na'vi spirituality is very interesting. They perceive the planet as a Gaia-like organic bioneurological network, which they personify as the goddess Ewa. The Na'vi believe that Ewa does not take sides between different species on Pandora, but promotes the balance and flourishing of the entire natural world. Na'vi spirituality seems to practice what we might call a relational animism. With such animism, respect towards all other organisms, even dangerous prey animals, is obligatory. And the Na'vi animism is rooted in their belief that Ewa is the author and origin of the vital interconnectedness of all living things. Ewa operates from the Tree of Souls, an Axos Mundi image in the film. And spoiler alert, Jake Sully's spirit and mind, through a ritual at the Tree of Souls, is permanently moved from his human into his avatar body, eliminating the need for either the breathing apparatus or the avatar technology. Sully thus becomes a fully naturalized member of Na'vi society. The film is pretty interesting philosophically, and in terms of philosophy of religion, pantheistic and animistic perceptions are depicted very artistically as compatible with monotheistic religious traditions, as well as with a more indigenous or naturalistic metaphysics of interconnectedness. The film has thus been widely written on by religious studies scholars, and has also been embraced by several indigenous communities such as Native and non-Native Hawaiians, who find some resonance with and incorporate many of the film's ethical and spiritual themes. There have also been some eco-feminist critiques of the film, arguing that Avatar presents a thinly veiled misogynistic plot tied to a romanticization of indigeneity. And the film can also be interpreted in terms of Jungian archetypal psychology and evolutionary biology. Ultimately, the film is a utopian vision that aims to avoid dystopian realities. And it is also an aesthetico-political work aimed at dismantling colonialistic ideologies. Includes here, as is customary for him, with a discussion of the differences and overlaps of spirituality and religion. Braun Taylor's view here is particularly helpful, and I'd like to adopt it for the rest of the course, if I may. It utilizes a concept which emerges from Wittgenstein's philosophy, that of family resemblance, which applied to religion and spirituality begins with the recognition that there are many dimensions and characteristics to what people call religion spirituality, and it rejects presumptions that any single trait or characteristic is essential to such phenomena. Yes, religion often refers more to organized and institutionalized religious belief and practice, and yes, spirituality often refers more to one's deepest moral values and most profound religious experiences. However, according to the family resemblance theory, when we do religious studies, we analyze religion resembling beliefs and practices, regardless of whether these are labeled as spirituality or religion by insiders or by outsiders. Spirituality usually involves some form of belief in invisible divine beings or a being, God, but it's also possible to speak of nature or earth-based spirituality, or even atheistic spirituality, and these are all religious phenomena, according to the terms of the family resemblance theory. Last, we've done two etymologies so far in this lecture video. The first was the etymology of religion, from religare, to rebind, or religere, to regather. And the second was the difference between the sacred and the holy in terms of the etymologies of Latin sacer and Indo-European heilig or hieros. The sacred having to do with that which is charged with divine presence but forbidden to touch, and the holy meaning having to do with that which is suffused with divine presence, usually in the context of ceremony. The title of our course is simply Spirit and Nature, so let's look at the root meanings of these two words in the English language. They're both, again, Latin terms. Spirit comes from spiritus and nature from natura. Greek near equivalents, although as we'll see there really are no equivalents when we translate fundamental words like this between languages, but the closest thing we can find is for spiritus, the Greeks say pneuma, and for natura, they say phusis. And also sometimes related to phusis and its pneuma, or nature, and its spirit, is psyche, or soul. The Hebrew term for spirit is ruach, and the Hebrew term for nature is teva. The Old German terms are Geist and Natur, or sometimes in earlier High German, before Latinization, Wesen. Pick any century or figure in the ancient Greek, ancient Roman, ancient Hebrew worlds, or Old Germanic worlds, and you will find many books and articles exploring the specificity of these two words, spirit and nature, in their original terminology in those traditions and eras. Western civilization itself is a fusion or a melting pot of Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, and Old Celtic or Germanic religious, cultural, and philosophical traditions. So when we say spirit and nature in English, we are always already speaking in the language of spiritus, natura, pneuma, physis, psyche, ruach, teva, Geist, Natur, and Wesen. We certainly have our work cut out for us in this course if we're to figure out what these two basic terms really mean. To be sure, the title of the course itself lends itself to the notion that spirit and nature are to be understood as a dichotomy, and even as an opposition. Nature on the one hand, or the earthly, spirit on the other, as the heavenly. But have spirit and nature always been opposed in terms of a dichotomy? That's a very hard question to answer. The distinction of spirit and nature in human religion and culture may go back to sky versus earth, or earth-based versus sky-based religious and spiritual cultures that are pre-Paleolithic, Paleolithic, Neolithic, etc. In the Western philosophical tradition, we notice first with Pythagoras and then especially in the Greek philosopher Plato the beginnings of a two-world theory. When you ask, what is real, is what exists, what is reality, Plato answers, well, it's two things, basically. On the one hand, it's the sensible world of nature, and on the other hand, it's the supersensible or immaterial world of the forms or ideas. Since at least Plato, and maybe a lot earlier, spirit has been understood more in terms of the invisible, and nature, the visible. But this fundamental dichotomy or dualism has not always been in currency, and it also didn't take root in many of the traditions we'll study in this course. Are spirit and nature ultimately opposites, like earth and heaven, or are spirit and nature the same thing? We're going to try to find out in this course, and it will be a long journey. Since I did my PhD in the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, since we'll be studying some of his work and other continental philosophers on spirit and nature in this course, I figured I'd lay my cards on the table and present some of the more accessible and interesting ideas on Heidegger on spirit and nature to close this video. So the ancient Greek term for nature, recall, was physis. In a famous essay on the essence and concept of physis in Aristotle's Physics, Heidegger gives us some needed background. The Latin term natura comes from nasi, to be born, to originate, and is the same as the Greek word genesis, origination. Nature has become a fundamental word in our language to designate all things that exist, all beings, and even being itself. Prevalent dichotomies that we find almost every day include nature versus grace or supernature, nature versus art, nature versus history, and the title of our course, Nature versus Spirit. And yet, we also speak of the nature of spirit, the nature of history, the nature of human beings, by which we mean what these things essentially are and how they are. Is the nature of grace, art, and history spiritual in its being? And if so, how exactly? Heidegger remarks that in Christian thought, the human being's natural state means what is bestowed upon humans in creation and turned over to their freedom. Left to itself, mere nature, through passion, brings about the destruction of the human being. The human being must transcend nature through grace, through faith. For this reason, nature must be suppressed. It is, in a certain sense, what should not be, or what participates in what is not, non-being. This is true of much of the tradition of Christian theology, but not all, as we'll study in this course. In another, more modern interpretation of nature, nature is understood precisely as will, power, drive, force, what is natural for human beings. According to Nietzsche, homo natura, or natural man, is someone who makes the body the key to his interpretation of the world, and thus secures a new and harmonious relationship with the sensible in general, and with the elements, fire, water, earth, light, and the passions and drives conditioned by them, by nature. Heidegger is one of the most interesting philosophers of nature in the Western tradition because, opposed to these two views of nature, he looks to the poet Friedrich Hölderlin to find a third. writing, "Finally, nature becomes the word for what is not only about everything elemental and everything human, but even above the gods." Thus, Hölderlin says in the hymn, as when on a feast day, "Now day breaks, I yearned for it and saw it come, and my word for what I saw shall be the holy, for nature herself, more ancient than the ages, and above the gods of Occident and Orient, nature has awakened with a clang of arms, and from high ether down to low abyss, according to fixed law, as once begotten out of holy chaos, nature herself feels herself renew." Heidegger comments that in Hölderlin's poem, nature becomes the name for what is above the gods and more ancient than the ages, in which beings always come to be. In a way, our word nature is a word for being, or the being of beings, the nature of things. And instead of understanding the gods or God as creators of nature, Hölderlin thinks the divine and the gods as something which, as well as human beings, come to be within nature. Heidegger next points to a very interesting idea, which is that in this basic dichotomy of spirit and nature, notice in our course, spirit comes first and then nature, Heidegger wonders if there's not in fact a basic priority of nature, such that perhaps the course should have been called Nature and Spirit. In all dichotomies between nature and its other, history, art, grace, spirit, etc., nature isn't just one of two equal terms, but essentially holds the position of priority, inasmuch as the other terms are always and primarily differentiated by contrast with, and therefore are determined by nature. For example, when nature is taken in a one-sided and superficial matter as stuff, or matter, materialism, elements, or the unformed, then spirit is taken correspondingly as the non-material, the spiritual, the creative, or that which gives form. First interesting question from Heidegger. And the second one, which flows from the first here, is how will we know what spirit is and what nature is when we don't know what being is? Note that nature seems to have a kind of priority, but this priority could very easily be reversed at the same time. Why not say the same and give spirit priority? So we have three very deep, fundamental philosophical and religious problems to address in this course. What is spirit? What is nature? And how are we going to answer that question until we know what being is? Part of this question of being will therefore involve learning to understand how history is determined by spirit as a history of spirit, and how nature lets itself be determined by spirit, without, however, ceasing to be nature, or perhaps being itself. Now, this is about all we can understand from Heidegger's important essay at this point. In asking after the essence of nature, we are asking about the being of nature. Is the being of nature what we call spirit, or is the being of spirit what we call nature? Both? Neither? One or the other? The fact is, we don't know. Really, we have no clue, whatever we think we know. And that's why we're doing this course. We are going to try to figure out what most of the world traditions have had to say about this, and thus to get some perspective on the being within which all discussion of the dichotomy of nature and spirit moves. Yes, we're going to accomplish that in most all the world's religious traditions, and some other fields as well. For Heidegger, one thing is certain: the differentiation of nature and spirit is foreign to ancient Greek philosophy and religion. It was a later import. The Greeks don't set nature and spirit apart and opposed to each other like we do, and it would be inconceivable in the context of ancient Greek philosophy for a course to be offered with a title like ours. Why is any of this important? Why do we need to think about what nature, spirit, being, history, etc. are in all the great world traditions and much else besides? Heidegger actually answers this question very succinctly and intelligibly. He says, well, the world is shifting out of joint, indeed if it ever was in joint, and the question arises whether modern humanities planning, even if it be worldwide, can ever bring about the ordering of the world. Next week, we'll begin with an influential but pretty problematic account of Judeo-Christianity's role in denaturing or spiritualizing nature via Lynn White's famous article, the historical roots of our ecological crisis, and from there we'll gradually move through the history of the world religions on spirit and nature. See you then, and welcome to the course.